All right. Real quick, disclaimer, all data in this presentation is fake. All the learnings and results and impact is real, which is the most important part, but all the data is fake. So real quick, what separates the top 1% from the bottom 99% in growth? It's a really quick answer. The answer is retention. Right? And the only graph you need to tell this story is this one right here, which Andrew Chen posted on his blog very recently. And what you're looking at here is basically the retention curves of the top 5,000 apps in the Android store. And what you see here on the very top line, the top 10 apps on that red line, the top 1%, basically separates themselves from the next 5,000. And so if there's one message that I want you to take home today from this presentation is that if you have poor retention, nothing else matters. Virality, acquisition, any of those components do not matter unless you have good retention. And so to show you what bad retention looks like over time, this is basically an overall growth curve. All the different colors and layers that you see here are separate cohorts of users by week, different groups of users that we've acquired by week. And as you can see over time, those basically layers get smaller and smaller and smaller because we're not retaining users. Now, it might look like we're growing at the very beginning, but as you see over time, as we start to layer those cohorts on over each other, the growth flattens off. And if we were to carry this out, the growth would actually start to decrease. And the reason is because we're not retaining users within each one of these layers. Good retention looks like this, where out of each sliver, we're retaining a certain percentage of users over a long period of time. And so as we acquire more users over more cohorts, we can start to see the layers stack on top of one another and start to cause growth. The best retention looks like this, right? And so in subscription-style businesses, there's something called net negative churn, where our cohorts of users on a revenue basis actually expand over time, which really causes that basically that exponential style curve. But there's more to the story about retention and why it's the most important thing. As I increase retention, I also increase a bunch of other things. As I increase retention, I'll increase my LTV. The longer I retain a user, the more money I'm going to make from them. The longer a user stays on Facebook, the more ads they can serve, the more money they make from that user. And as I increase my LTV, I can afford a higher CPA at the top of the funnel. That increases my growth opportunities. I might be able to acquire more users from different channels that were more expensive previously, and I can basically spend more at the top of the funnel. Beyond that, as I increase retention, I also increase virality. So the longer a user sticks around, the more opportunities I get to basically prompt that user to invite other users. For example, the longer a user stays on Dropbox, the more folders that they might share with other people outside of Dropbox over time, which brings them into the Dropbox product. As I increase virality, I basically decrease my effective CPA at the top of the funnel, and I can get more out of the same amount of budget. I can get more users out of the same budget that I had previously. And last but not least, as I increase retention, I can also increase upgrade rates, especially in subscription products. So in some of the freemium products that we work on, what we see is the longer that we retain users, the more percentage people we get to upgrade in a cohort. And as I do that, I basically decrease my payback period, which means every dollar that I invest in acquisition, I get back much faster. So I can reinvest that at a much faster rate and grow faster. And so every improvement to retention also improves all of the other factors of your business, whether it's virality, LTV, or payback period, which why ultimately retention is kind of the king of growth, the holy grail of growth. And so what I want to do is kind of break down basically how to go ahead and understand retention. And so retention all starts with this. It's basically a chart like this from Mixpanel, and these are basically just cohorts. And what you see on the left-hand side is basically the number of users I've acquired in a week, and then how many weeks later, what percentage of them are still around using the product. So you can see out of row 1, column 5, I basically have 57% of that. I can't even read this right now, but like 1,000 and some users basically still retained in that product. But it's hard to really look at this and understand your retention by just looking at a big grid of numbers like this. And so we take this chart and turn it into a graph like this, basically a retention cohort curve. So we take one of those rows, we throw it in Excel, and we graph it out over time. And we can start to get a much clearer picture of how our retention is looking over time. Now, the most important factor of these retention cohort curves is one thing and one thing only, and that is that they flatten out at some point. As they flatten out at some point, you're going to get cohorts of users that retain over a long period of time, and that layering effect that you saw in one of those original graphs that I showed, where basically these cohorts start to stack on top of each other. If your retention is trending towards 0, that's a very bad thing, because that means over a certain period of time, you're going to churn through 100% of your users that you've acquired in a given week. That makes it really, really hard to sustain growth over a long period of time. But to understand this curve, you can't just look at it and say, well, I want to optimize this thing. We really need to break it down into pieces. And so there's 3 major chunks that we can break it down into. The first one is what I call week 1 retention. This could also be day 1 retention if you're working with like a mobile app or a mobile game. It could also be month 1 retention if you're working with a product that has kind of a longer onboarding process. But week 1 retention, this small little sliver, is all about how we get users to experience the core value of our product as quickly as possible. So one concept that you've probably heard of is the aha moment, right? Twitter and Facebook commonly refer to that. And that's basically what is that experience, what is that action that makes your users understand the value that your product delivers? And there's one key thing about week 1 retention. Even though it's the smallest sliver on that retention curve, it tends to have the biggest impact. Every percentage improvement that I make to week 1 retention tends to cascade throughout the entire retention curve, which causes that curve to shift up. And so that has a major, major impact over a long period of time. And so on a macro level, the main strategies to do this are all around better onboarding, getting them to that core value as quickly as possible. And you can also go through clearer messaging, as well as what I call a segmented NUX, a new user experience, basically segmenting your new user experience based on who the person is. And I'm going to talk about this in a little more detail in a second. The second major part of a retention curve is basically your midterm retention, the center section. So after I get a user to experience that core value as quickly as possible, I have to do something even harder, which is basically create habits around that core value, rewire their brain. The hardest thing to change in this world is basically human behavior. We are stubborn, stubborn people, right? And so a lot of people make the misconception that if I get them to understand that core value up front once, that they're just going to automatically remember it and come back to my application or my product and start using it. And so we have to reinforce this and help create habits basically around this core value. And then the third part of this is basically long-term retention. So I've gotten them to experience that core value up front. I've started to rewire their brain and create habits over time. But then I have to get users in front of that core experience as often as possible. The more I do this over a long period of time, the better chance I have at retaining them over a long period of time. And so these second 2 sections, the main strategies are about how you slow or flatten the curve off, right? And there's a lot of different strategies to do this by refining current feature sets, using something that I call retention hooks, right? The best example of this is LinkedIn. LinkedIn are masters at this, where they specifically create hooks in the product that draw other users back in, right? So as I endorse somebody on my team, that's going to send them an email, bring them back into the product, asks them to endorse me. They might endorse me back, which brings me back into the product, so on and so forth. The third is just product quality. As you have a more stable product and can deliver a better product experience with less bugs, we often see sort of this retention curve flatten off over time. And then the fourth bucket is resurrection. So basically, people who might have churned or not retained in earlier parts, how do you reacquire them over time, right? The social games, Zynga and the mobile games, were masters at this, where somebody might use and play a game for a month at a time and then get bored of it. And then a month later, Zynga basically creates a bunch of new content or a bunch of new levels to basically resurrect and re-engage that user back into the product. But there's one thing that I want you to notice that I didn't say among all these strategies, and that's basically add new features. While new features can certainly affect retention, the common misconception is that new features are basically the savior to all your problems, when in fact, in 90% of the cases, that's actually not the fact, right? As you add more core features to your product, you're actually making your product more complex, harder to understand for a user, harder for them to experience that very simple aha moment very upfront. And so there's a lot of things that you can do to increase retention without adding new features. And so I want to show you a little bit of an example of this, where a product I work on called Sidekick at getsidekick.com, it's a new product that's out of our company. It's basically an email plugin product. We help people with email productivity by pulling in your contact social information, letting you track emails, see who opens and clicks on your emails, as well as a few other things. And we went through a huge growth curve, and about late last year we looked at retention very deeply, and we saw two things. First thing was that out of newer cohorts, our week 1 retention was decreasing. We were getting worse and worse at that new user experience. And secondly, over a very long period of time, a year or more, we started to see that retention curve trend towards 0, right? So that second problem wasn't a major problem up front, but it was certainly something that we wanted to address. And so we basically went down this path of how do we figure out what to improve. And there's 3 things that we kind of go through and look at before we actually start to experiment. The first is that we segment these retention curves by every facet that we possibly can, whether that's their acquisition source, what email client they're using, what persona they might be, the type of email, free mail versus corporate. And what we're looking for to see is how do these, as we segment, how do these retention curves basically look differently? And so a good example of that is we basically segmented the curve by people who signed up with their corporate emails versus people who signed up with Gmail and other free mail. And what we noticed was that not only did they have corporate emails have higher week 1 retention, but they had slower user churn over a long period of time. And so this started to hint at people who entered our funnel with a work in a professional context were actually much better users for us than free mail users. So we started to think about, well, what are all the strategies that we can do to get people in this corporate, this work, this professional mindset up front in the sign up and onboarding process. The second thing we did was looked at leading quantitative indicators. And so what we wanted to do is basically compare 2 groups, those who churned in the first week, basically those who churned in the first week and those who ended up retaining, and starting to look at different behavioral patterns to see what were the quantitative behaviors that basically distinguish those 2 groups. And so one thing that we found in this group was basically that 80% of the people who churned in the first week only sent 1 email with our product installed. And that really didn't make sense to us because our product works in such a way that once you install it, there's nothing else that you have to do. You basically have to just send emails like normal. And so what we noticed is that people were taking very specific hard actions to only track 1 email within that first week. And so that started to lead to a bunch of ideas and indications for us as well. The third thing we did is collect a bunch of one-on-one qualitative data. And so we basically took that group of users who didn't retain in that first week, or basically only sent that 1 email with our product installed, and we sent them an email. Looked very personal, and we said, we noticed you installed the product, we tried it out, but only used it with 1 email. We were wondering why. Very open-ended. Then we get a bunch of responses, and we can engage them in an email conversation saying, hey, please tell us more, why? And after a couple hundred responses, basically, we can start to categorize our findings in different groups. And what we found was some didn't see the value, they didn't understand the product, some ran into certain bugs, some we didn't support current browsers. The big thing about this is that now we actually have trends, things, buckets that we can start to brainstorm ideas against, on how to fix it and how to influence it, rather than just basically taking a bunch of stabs in the dark. The second piece of this is we pay very close attention to the language that they're using. And so out of this huge bucket that they didn't understand the product, a lot of people said they didn't have time to figure it out. And once again, that didn't really make sense to us because once you install the product, you don't have to do anything. There's nothing to figure out. You basically just start sending emails. And so this led to a bunch of experiment ideas, 68 experiments in total, actually. And the end result of that was that without launching a single new feature, we were able to drastically not only shift the curve up, but flatten off over time. And the improvements that we ended up making in this time period will net us basically hundreds of thousands of users over the next year. The 5 main strategies that ended up working for us were these. The first was that we basically started treating the new user experience as a completely separate experience. We siloed it off from the core application. And you'll see this commonly with Facebook, Twitter, and other people, where the experience that you get if you're a new user is totally different than the core application. That experience is firmly designed to drive you towards that one action that helps you experience that core value as quickly as possible. We also segmented based on persona. For us, that was basically what professional role they were in. Were they a salesperson, a BD person, a marketer versus whatever? You also see this in common products like Pinterest. The experience that you get up front if you're a female differs than if you're a male, right? If I'm a male and I sign up, I don't want to see a bunch of pins on weddings and flowers and cute puppies, right? I probably want to see something else. The third is that after we got that data from segmenting the retention cohort, we did a lot of experiments how we switched the personal context into work context. So if they signed up with the personal email, we said, hey, this actually works really well with your work email as well. Why don't you enter your work email at the same time? This had a huge effect as well. We also tested the medium of education. We tested videos, we tested tooltips, we tested about 5 other things. And while we had a lot of tips from other people saying, videos work best, tooltips work best, we actually found that the results for us differ drastically. And so make sure you test the medium of education that you're going through. And last but not least, we kind of found this on accident. We were accidentally subscribing some of our signups to our content and our content presence. We found that over time, users on that list were basically retaining for us as well. And so that's the end of my presentation. If you want more details on the experiments that we actually ran, sign up for my blog at coelevate.com. I'm going to be releasing that sort of next week. Thank you.